Good evening, everyone. And this is going to be slightly different because an economist is talking to all of you. So it's going to be a non-technical kind of a disposition from here on for next 15 to 20 minutes. So there's a lot to cover actually because I'm not just going to be talking of India, I'm just going to be covering the entire global economy and how trends are shifting and what we need to do at a level where we need to make sure that retirement is just a pause and not a full stop. And that is why the title that was given to me was When Should We Hit the Brake? I have, to my convenience, changed it to When Do We Hit a Break, which is just a break in post-retirement, post-60. What do we do? Is it a thank you, goodbye kind of a situation after 60? Or we, a few of us, and hopefully most of us, make ourselves as more relevant and continue the relevance that we bring to the table, to our organizations, to the society in general, and broadly to the nation. So to begin with, as an economist, obviously I would like to draw your attention that last few years we have heard a lot about how India has begun to make a difference to the world in the sense of its contribution to the global economy, to the global GDP. And there's a quick snapshot of how we have risen up that ladder since last few decades. Look at this chart, which just kind of captures the rising economic power that India has been gradually climbing, and particularly the last 2 decades have been such that from a position of 12th in the global economy, we have risen to 5th position in the global economy. And over the next 5 years, quite quickly, we are going to be somewhere close to the 3rd in the pecking order as far as the contribution to global growth and global economy is concerned. Of course, it's still a small number. Currently, we are, if I were to rattle off some numbers, currently we would be somewhere close to 3.5 trillion GDP economy. Maybe, by 2028, we will come close to about 6 trillion economy, but it is still going to be a little over 1/5 of what US will be in 2028 and 1/4 of what China would be, say, at $24 trillion economy. Having said, it is important to note that India has, over the last 2 decades, made very rapid strides in becoming more and more relevant and important to a place of advantageous position. And what has brought this about is this chart. Now, this is nothing but a snapshot of no businesses operate in policy vacuum, right? We all need an enabler. We all need a conducive economic and policy environment to make good of the aspirations, be it an entrepreneurship, be a retail individual, be any stakeholder of the economy. We need a certain ambiance, a certain comfort, a certain policy thrust and push to help us achieve those goals and ambitions. Now, this is a chart where there is a certain set of economists belonging to Chicago Booth, to Stanford, and to Northwestern Kellogg University called Baker, Bloom, and Davis, who actually have created mapping of policy certainty stroke uncertainty across the globe and country-wise. What basically does it imply is it actually captures how certain is the policy path. Is it going to be start, stop? Is it going to be 4 steps ahead and 3 backward? So this is what imparts certainty or uncertainty. These economists set up an index, created an index of policy uncertainty on the website called policyuncertainty.com. You all can go and access it. And here is where we track the difference where India started to hive off from the global trend. Look at the light blue chart. The light blue, higher the graph is greater the uncertainty. till certain time of 2015, 2016, India was broadly in conjunction with the similar global environment. But look at the latter chart. India, in a dark blue line which tracks, has actually begun to rank better, inverse is better here, rank better in terms of greater degree of policy certainty. And why is it so? Now, if you look at the last few years, and particularly if you zero in on 2024, we all know half of world's population has either in last 6 months undergone an election or over the next 6 months will be choosing a new government, something which has almost come by last evening or this morning in UK. And the more important one that all of us will have our ears and eyes onto is an election in November, where, for all you know, we could have change in leadership. In the US, it's still an uncertain world. So what important point is that it still renders global environment still with uncertainty. Now, the reason I say this, it is also juxtaposed. Why this uncertainty hits upon us is if you look at the factors over the last few years. Now, I'm sure you all recollect that we had 2008-9, the global financial crisis. Let's not forget, in very quick succession after the GFC, we've had many such global upheavals and disruptive events. Soon after the GFC, we had the sovereign balance sheet crisis of Europe. We all know, taper tantrum in 2014. Following that, we had the most unexpected catastrophic event through COVID. Close on heels of COVID came the wars, which are still ongoing. So the point I'm trying to make is this global environment is facing one after the other in quick succession an onslaught from these kind of catastrophic events. What it manifests in is high inflation, income inequality, the ongoing geopolitical skirmishes, which do not seem to be stopping anytime soon, and as a result of which, people looking at their economy in a more closed manner. I'm sure you all have heard of protectionism, economic fragmentation. All of these have been with us now for almost a decade or so, beyond a decade, in fact, for that matter. What has happened is all these factors, economic shocks that I spoke of just now, do have a bearing on business climate, business positivity, the kind of expectation of how our respective businesses will play out. So these are the kind of backdrop of economic events that determine and govern how we want to plan our businesses going forward. This is where India did very well around the COVID times, and during the COVID and the COVID shock, India actually hived off in terms of imparting better economic environment to our country as compared to what other nations, including the DMs, the developed markets, could do. What the development markets did were they just printed money, causing inflation of unacceptable levels, where the mandate would be 2% of inflation. US saw inflation of close to 9.5%. Unheard of, unthinkable. But these were all manifestations of how the economy got handled by the policymakers. In contrast, India did exceedingly well, exceptionally well, in terms of managing the crisis and converting the crisis into an opportunity. And this is borne out very well by this chart. Now, if you compare the GDP, I'm sure, I don't want to throw in too much jargon, but I'm sure you all know GDP, that is the measure of economic activity in terms of national income. And this is where, if you look at the two charts, look at the left chart around the COVID year, where India had actually somewhere gotten middle of the rung of performers, where India had a shock of almost 6% delta in terms of GDP growth. This is where India was in 2020 measurement of growth, that is growth in income, national income, vis-a-vis the year prior to COVID. Look at how India has performed, and a very dramatic shift that somewhere from the middle of worst performing economies, India actually catapulted to the topmost and the best performing economy if you look at the 2023 GDP. And I'm sure you all read enough press to understand that today India is one of the fastest growing large economies that matter. We are going to post somewhere close to 7% of growth in this year as well, which actually makes on the trot 4 years for India posting 7% or thereabouts growth. How does it imply? What does it imply? Yes, in terms of inflation, like elsewhere, supply chain shocks, raw material shortage shocks, health shocks, etc., it did manifest in India also. Experiencing a high inflation, and particularly in India, a peculiar driver of inflation predominantly is food inflation, which actually is not fair to the inequitable way it distributes the burden of price changes to India's population, because affordability and in terms of wage inequality, food prices have a larger shock in a more meaningful manner. So inequality is one that India has lived with. That is where we have not done well at all. But if I were to give you a top-down 20,000 feet view of how the broad economy has done, India has done pretty well in terms of managing its burdens well, managing the government finances well in a way that it doesn't push our interest rates high, it doesn't push our trade imbalances high, and more importantly, having those manifestations in, with rupee bearing the larger burden of all those macroeconomic imbalances, as we call amongst economists. So the short point is, India did exceedingly well in terms of managing its COVID and thereafter shocks in a very prudent manner, supporting the policies for growth and not allowing all of it to result in shrinkages. That has actually given us the confidence of dreaming and continuing to dream big, where our government in Delhi has etched out that by the 100th year of our independence, we are going to remove the tag of developing nation, and we are going to move to a status of developed nation. That is what is basically a Viksit Bharat implies. What would it need for that? We would obviously need India's GDP on the trot to grow at least between 7 to 8% on an average basis over the rest of the years. Is it possible? A huge yes, because the way our growth impulses, our growth drivers are getting broadened and diversified, the larger the diversified contribution of each growth impulse, greater is the possibility and probability of India being able to maintain the kind of growth and withstanding the global shocks far better than others. So what we look at is, by 2047, India's GDP is going to be close to 31 trillion, right? We are currently at 3.5, and we need to get there rapidly with an 8% growth. We will get there. And what it implies at per capita, this becomes very important, because currently we may be around 2.5, 3, dollars, $2.5, $3,000 per capita. We need to get there to $17,000 to achieve a tag of a developed nation, which is basically implying that we need to grow at least over 7.5 times, 17 times of what we are currently. Am I getting the numbers right? No, it is actually a 7% increase, close to $19,000 per capita, which will basically take us to this kind of a developed status tag. But is all hunky and dory with how we take that production and income levels to that level? Perhaps not. A very key important element and factor of production, as we call it in economics, is its human resources. And this is where my next part of the conversation is going to be, because at the end of the day, you must be wondering, she's going to be talking of retirement dilemma and what is this about economics background. But it was important to give, because this is where it tells you how well prepared we need to be in fortifying and strengthening the biggest factor of production which generates income, which is human resources. India has a very, very peculiar and I would say skewed and complex nature at this point in time in terms of what we call the nature of our workforce. Why do I say that? While our median age is 28 years, and we all know by now, everyone has told us that India has a young population, which is true. Nevertheless, that India will continue to have a larger share, over 65% of our total population is going to be in the working age population. Why do we talk and harp about this as being an advantage? That means the working age population will continue to earn, the ability to earn a wage, earn an income, earn an ability to save. It actually helps you sustain that growth. So it's important, if I'm not earning, I won't be spending more. If I don't spend more, why will people produce goods and services? So it's kind of a feedback loop, and therefore you need a younger or working age population which has the ability to earn, which has ability to spend and create a positive growth multiplier thereof, and also ability to save. And that is why we keep harping about why India has a very good solid vantage point of having that young population or working age population. However, if you look closely and deeply, what are the dynamics of that? As high as 90% of this population is unorganized sector. That is, a large part of this is either in agriculture or in unorganized services sector, and even in some of the smaller segments of manufacturing sector. So broadly, of the huge working age population that we speak of, as high as 90% still remains unorganized. Why do we need an organized workforce? Because the benefits that accrue to a workforce are far better if they are more organized, if they have a decent bargaining power to work alongside the employers to be able to get a more gainful earning and wages and salaries. So it is important to have an organized status to this workforce. The third and more disturbing element, of course, is that while we have a young population, we also have high unemployment numbers. And if you notice, I've deliberately not put a number of unemployed, youth unemployment being higher, because I'm going to be very candid here. It's actually impossible to draw a number of how many people are unemployed in the youth. Look at the rural economy. If 20 people are working on that same agriculture plot, land, everyone seemingly looks employed, but the same agri output could be delivered by just 5 people. So what we call in economics as disguised unemployment is basically that those 14, 15 people seemingly look employed, but actually they can be done away with, and still we can have the same output. So seemingly you have a large employment, but if you look at the factor productivity, it is abysmally low. And that is why I do not get tempted to put a number to unemployment numbers. All numbers have their own role to play, but if anybody asks me what is the unemployment, officially it could be anywhere between 5, 6, 7%. In actual, it could be 10, 12, 15%. And that is the reason we do not vociferously, at least I do not vociferously talk about it. And the last point that I want to, how much time do I have? Oh, time's up. Oh my God, I've not even come there at the problem. Can I have 5 minutes? Great. Thank you for the grace marks. I'm going to rush through this. This is the great decade, and this is where I come to the topic, incidentally, is the great transition decade. Why do I say that? While we do have a young population, but look at the 2023 number and 2030 numbers, where the 60 plus and 65 plus start growing in terms of percentage share. If you look at the lower bottom of the table, from 10 to 20, we are going to be a larger share of aging population. So while we are young, the process of aging has begun far more quickly, and this is where our policy making has to focus on. Very quickly on the chart of this, the last two lines, the red line and the gray line, is what we need to focus on, because this is where the retired people will be constituting this part, and this from 10, as I said, is going to go to 20%, and if I average it out, it's going to be 15% of our population is going to be 65 plus. How do we deal with that? This I'm going to skip. This is the crux of the matter, is basically, I will, in next 2-3 minutes, I'll wrap up the story. There are 2 or 3 positions or ways we look at it. How do we deal with it? One is, of course, the institutions have to play a role. The government, and more importantly, the corporates. I have listed down a few things. At government level, at the age of 60, you start wondering, do I earn enough as saving returns? Do I get fiscal incentives? Will the government take care of providing me assured returns so that I don't have to work on a compulsion basis to earn, but I have something that I want to bring and return to the society? So income is not my basic consideration. It is a consideration, but not my primary consideration. So for that, you need government support to design adequate fiscal incentives, tax incentives, so that people get more returns or assured returns on their savings, which they may have accumulated over their work lifetime. The next is, of course, a healthcare program. For a lot of retired people, something like a work portal, which I'm told that the government has introduced, but it's only for the government employees. But what we at NASSCOM can also do is have a portal where the private sector retired people can register themselves on the portal, and it's just basically a platform to match the demand and supply kind of facilitation, where you have the availability of information of the people who are willing to work, able to work post 60, and they are available for employment, and institutions like NASSCOM are looking for such people. I think that's where we need. The government can also, a lot of us have an entrepreneurial streak amongst us, so why not have the government provide seed capital, create a fund for senior citizens, and then we can tap those seed capital funds and have an entrepreneurial manifestation for a lot of us. Most important, corporates have a large role to play. It is basically retraining and skill development. We all know that AI has been the biggest disruptor in the last few years. Even within the 40-year-old tech population, I'm sure a constant retraining, reskilling will be the demand for remaining relevant, and importantly, giving a facility for adapting ourselves. Then we have, of course, a work environment which takes care of the seniors. More importantly, with a long, experience and wisdom, these are the guys who can help and lead research and development or corporate social responsibility activities, because this is one very valid, solid platform being made available by the policy, by the mandated policy, and so on. And this is where the 60 plus can be harnessed and utilized. Of course, have the mentor-mentee relation and equations and programs, which in my erstwhile organizations, we actually had senior people becoming mentors and actually helping the new joinees get adapted to the work environment, the work rules, the responsibilities, and so on. And of course, their role in devising and defining the strategy. What are the broader global policies? I think this I'm going to run through, but important one is GCC is the biggest growth platform for the country. Today we have over 1,600 GCCs. We have the capacity to grow it into 2x or 3x. most important is for these 60 plus individuals can have a gig model of nurturing of professionals and consultants and so on. That is very important. And the last is the women participation, which becomes extremely important. Today, India has one of the most abysmally low women participation rate, and particularly for 60-65 plus, it's as low as just 8%. For men, it is so much more at 36%. I think this is where NASSCOM has to make an attempt at. And the last slide is more of a motherhood statement, but I'm nevertheless going to leave you with that. It is how you financially plan, how you make attitudinal changes. You can't say, I'm retired, I don't want to learn. You've got to be reinventing, adapting yourself. You have to remain relevant if you enjoy your work. You've got to be relevant. But most important is the last column, which is live in the moment, adopt your hobbies, have new leisure activities, and you are sorted. So basically, self-help is the best help. Government, corporates will be there to help you tide through this retirement as a break, but you have to make yourself extremely relevant by helping yourself with constantly learning and staying with the young population to keep your mind always young, always ready to learn. On this note, I'll stop. I'm sorry, I've seriously overexceeded my time. Thanks, bye.
For more content on tech and leadership, subscribe to NASSCOM YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update.